Afternoon. Welcome everyone to the June 11th, 2018 Administrative Committee meeting. To my right is Councilperson Art Bedke, and to my left is Councilperson Ann Zabala. To our left is Jen Piffner representing the city. Our first item today is approval of the Administrative Committee meeting minutes from May 29th.
Look good to me.
I was not here.
Okay, well, they look good to me, so we'll approve those. Our second item is a discussion regarding educational institutions in the Central Business District. Mr. Belknap, I will mention, because I know there are some people in the room who would like to discuss this, I think it is prudent to have this discussion in front of the entire council so that the discussion can be with the entire council. So if you would bear with me, we'll wait another week and then we will have public comment with that. So, Mr. Belknap, that being said, hit us, man.
Good afternoon. Well, hopefully I won't hit you too hard, but I think my goal was to maybe provide a little bit of history.
Perfect.
About zoning in the Central Business District and allowable uses, and then talk about how education institutions came to be and what occurred in 2005, applications we've seen since that point, and kind of maybe some suggestions about how the council might be able to gather more information on the topic in order to inform policy development moving forward. So as I mentioned, on the 21st of May, we had a fairly large code amendment that came before the council. It was really not changing a lot of the code, but it was changing its structure. And it was moving it from more of a narrative format into a tabular format for ease of use and consistency and compatibility. During that discussion, there were some questions that were raised about the allowance of educational institutions downtown. And in that process, the council ultimately did approve the code amendment as it existed, which really largely focused and continued to allow educational institutions in the Central Business District as a conditionally permitted use. But they also requested that we come back to the Administrative Committee, and I think Gary suggested we could come back to talk about the council and find out specifically if the council wishes to have the Planning and Zoning Commission review this topic, kind of specifically what they would like the commission to review, since they had gone through that process through the overall code amendment as well as the amendment that happened in 2005. As we step back to zoning, really the fundamental purpose of zoning was to restrict the use of private land and to segregate uses that were thought to be incompatible. And in the classical sense, it's the home next to the smelter or the rendering plant or the heavy industrial use. And that's really kind of the basis of the formation of zoning as we understand it today. Often residential and commercial uses are segregated and separated, but that has begun to change quite a bit recently over the course of really the last decade or last 20 years, that there has been an increasing focus of integrating land uses in order to provide services and create walkable communities and reduce vehicular trips through mixed-use development. But that's really the basis of zoning, dates back to the industrial age, or even before that, but the primary in the U.S. is related to heavy industrial uses. A general goal is to group compatible uses of similar intensities within the same zoning district. Incompatibility in land uses can often occur in a number of different ways, and usually it's related to some sort of impact that one use has that is damaging to another. And it could be noise or traffic or air emissions or hazardous materials or environmental impacts or vibrations or dust or maybe light pollution or hours of operation. There are a whole number of things related to a land use that could be impactful to other land uses in an area. And so the goal overall is to just group compatible uses that have similar operating characteristics, that utilize similar public resources and services in order to maintain that compatibility and to not adversely impact uses. There are a number of forms of zoning. Euclidean, which is really regulating by land use, which is largely what we have and is most common across the U.S. There are other forms that have developed over time, performance zoning, that really measures kind of impacts of the use. And so it's an impact-based, sometimes it's a scorecard type system where different levels of impact are scored and determine whether a use is compatible within a zoning district or not. And then most recently we've seen form-based zoning that has really moved away from regulation of actually land use, what occurs in the structure, and focuses more on the form of the structure, its relationship to the public place, to the street, to the sidewalk, and really looks at the urban to the rural spectrum, the transect as I call it, from the urban center out to the rural edges, and really has much less focus on the regulation of the actual use that occurs in the structures, but more about the character of the buildings themselves. In most zoning districts, they allow, in Euclidean zoning, which is really largely what our code is, it identifies allowable uses, those that are called conditionally permitted uses, and then we have what we call bulk and dimensional standards. So that's how wide or how large does the lot need to be, how tall can build structures be, how far do they need to be away from adjacent property lines, and other development standards like off-street parking and other components. As I mentioned, our code is largely Euclidean with some form-based elements that appear in various locations. And again, regulations based on land use, not necessarily the tax status of an organization. Really, we're looking at the use itself. So if it's a professional office use and it's for a nonprofit organization, it's still a professional office use. We're just regulating the use, not necessarily its tax status. For the city of Moscow, we have a number of residential zones, and we also have a number of commercial zoning districts, ranging in the residential from ag forest up to multiple family residential R4, and on the commercial side from residential office all the way up to industrial and the urban mixed commercial zoning designation. So I thought I'd take a quick look at zoning as it has existed downtown over the history of the city. And the first zoning ordinance that I could find was from 1933. There was a commercial and business zone, and there was a residential zone. And those were really the two divisions of the city at that point in time. The commercial and business zone that encompassed most of the downtown area essentially allowed all uses, all commercial and all residential, and any other enterprise that was defined at that time. The next amendment, substantial rewrite of the zoning code, was in 1957. The Central Business District was created at that point in time, and it allowed private schools conducted for gain was really the only use identified. So we had all other uses permitted in residential districts. We had stores and shops, banks, offices, studios, hotels, restaurants, tea rooms, cafes, and other places serving food and beverage, theaters, amusement houses, bowling alleys, dance halls, skating rinks. But the only thing that was really somewhat related to educational uses were the private schools conducted for gain. Then beginning in 1950, also in the 1957 amendment, we had in the R3 district, which was at that point in time our multiple family residential district, institutions for higher education was listed in the code. Now that use wasn't defined, but it is somewhat self-explanatory, but that was the first appearance of a specific reference to a college or university type use in the city zoning code in 1957. And at that point in time, all of the university's campus was technically zoned multifamily residential. So that use did appear in that zoning district, but it was not defined. It included institutions for higher education, fraternity or sorority houses, and when related to a college or university. The next large code amendment was in 1971. Central business becomes a community business, so they retitled the zoning district, and educational institution was first defined then in the 1971 code, and was not listed use within the business or community business district, what they called the BC district at that time. The next large code amendment was in 1981. The educational institution definition now disappears. So it appeared in the 1971 ordinance, and in 1981 that definition fell out of the definition section of the code. But what was created in 1981 was a university zoning district, and so that was the first appearance of the U-zone, and that use of educational institutions was named in the university zoning district. It just had fallen out of the definition section of the code.
I need to ask you a quick question. In this process, were conditional uses permitted? Was the process in place or not?
There were conditionally permitted uses, but educational institutions were not on that list.
Okay,
at that
okay,
time.
thank you.
The next large code amendment was in 1990. Again, it moved then from the business community to central business district. There were a list of a number of uses: vocational schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, and similar public or private institutions were allowed, excluding elementary and junior high schools at that time. And the educational institution definition then reappears in the definition section in 1990. And that's largely what we had in the code up until about 2005 at that point. Beginning in, I think, late 2004 and early 2005, there were 2 educational uses that were allowed within commercial zoning districts in the city. The first of which was New St. Andrews College in the Central Business District, and at that point in time, the zoning administrator had determined that he felt that it was a permitted use by right underneath the category of churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, libraries, museums, art galleries, police and fire stations, and similar public or private institutions. So that was the land use category, and there is some language in the code that allows some flexibility of the zoning administrator where a use is not specifically named to interpret it, to look at similar or comparable uses, and that was the determination that was made at that point in time. Additionally, we had the Paradise Creek Regional Alternative High School that went into the old Circle K building in the Motor Business District, and a zoning complaint was received both on this use as well as that use. Paradise Creek was allowed at that point in time, again, under a similar category of use, but it also included commercial schools as a use by right in the Motor Business District at that time. So we read commercial schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, libraries, parks, museums, art galleries, police and fire stations, and similar public or private institutions. And again, the zoning administrator at that time felt that the alternative high school was very similar in nature to these uses in commercial schools and determined that they were a use by right in that zoning district. Both of those interpretations did have a potential conflict in the code, and that was specifically that educational institutions, that definition came back in 1990 and existed there. And so that would have addressed a private college use, and it was defined in the code, and it was not specifically named in that zoning district. The same thing for schools. Schools that were operated under a K through 12 age range were also defined in the code and was not specifically named into this category of uses in the Motor Business District. Commercial schools was named, obviously, but that is a different definition than just schools in general. So those interpretations and the allowance and existence of those 2 uses appear to conflict with those definitions, and the fact that our zoning code is what's deemed to be an exclusionary code. That is, if a use is not named in a zoning district, then it's deemed not to be a permitted use in that zoning district. The City Council at that time referred the matter to the Planning and Zoning Commission to conduct a comprehensive review of the allowance of schools in commercial zoning districts. So it was not merely focused on educational institutions. It was schools, commercial schools, and educational institutions were reviewed, and all of the city's commercial zoning districts were evaluated at that time. And Art probably recalls this from P&Z days. Well. Yes. The commission conducted a great deal of work and provided their recommendations to the City Council that was adopted through Ordinance 2005-33 in December of 2005, and that modified the allowance of those uses in the city's commercial zoning districts. When the council forwarded the matter to the Planning and Zoning Commission to review it, the Planning and Zoning Commission discussed the matter over the course of 10 meetings and hearings, accepting significant written testimony and over 8 hours of oral testimony during that time period. And the file from that time period is somewhat thick, and this is all the materials, written materials that was received at that time. I was going to scan this in and put it in the packet, but I thought that might be a bit much just yet. But that was the discussion that was held, and the work that P&Z did. And as Art can recall, the commission did spend a great deal of time working on the discussion. The council received the commission's recommendations on November 14th, and the council conducted a hearing on December 5th. They passed the ordinance under first reading with some minor amendments, and then the council then reconsidered it on December 19th, and at that point passed it under suspension of the third reading, and that is what ultimately amended the code. The ordinance allowed schools, commercial schools, and educational institutions as a conditionally permitted use in the residential office, neighborhood business, motor business, general business, central business, with the exception of schools was excluded, and as a use by right in the university zone, which it previously was already. They also included a parking standard for educational institutions, so the use was named and defined in the zoning code, but in our table, where all the uses are listed in the required off-street parking, they didn't exist, and there was not a parking standard for that use. So that was included to the table, but that would only, by the way the parking standards work, it would only apply to those uses located outside the central business district. Everything inside the central business district is exempted from that table underneath the code. So the central business district, as you look at the intents and purposes statement from the code, is to provide a location for groups of compatible commercial uses having the common characteristic of not involving more than incidental and minimal assembly, fabrication, or storage of commodities. For example, establishments dispensing retail commodities and those providing professional and personal services to the individual. The central business zoning district is the most intensive commercial zoning district to promote pedestrian use. Unbroken street level commercial frontage is encouraged in the zoning district. And that's really the large driver behind not having any off-street parking requirement. If you were to require off-street parking of downtown, it would look very much like a mall with large parking lots and broken street front. It would certainly not create the pedestrian environment that is the intention of the central business zoning district. Within the central business district, the current permitted principal uses include amusement and recreation facilities. So that include bowling centers, dance halls, fitness centers, mini golf, movie theaters, actually sports arenas and stadiums currently. Financial and professional services, and that's a long list of agencies and brokerages, insurance companies, any type of professional social advocacy organizations, commercial banking, savings institutions, data processing and hosting and related services, professional technical and scientific services, publishing industries, real estate services, financial investments, software publishers. So there's kind of a long list of financial and professional offices are allowed. Food and beverage services, obviously drinking places, restaurants, and beverage manufacturing as it relates to breweries and wineries. Retail sales, again, retail sales, consumer good rentals, laundries and dry cleaners, personal care services. Public institutional uses, so civic and social organizations, community neighborhood centers, government office buildings, healthcare services, museums, and art galleries, public parks and recreation facilities, and religious facilities. Those are all allowed by right. Vehicles and equipment, so electronic repair, parking lots and garages, personal and household goods and services are allowed, and visitor accommodations. That include anything from the bed and breakfast range up through hotels, motels. Currently, all uses, as I mentioned, within the central business district are exempted from being required to provide off-street parking. And so this is the older table. The new table is not quite on the online code, but it just lists the use and identifies how many parking spaces have to be provided. And just ahead of that table, the central business district is exempted from that table for the provision of off-street parking. One of the concerns that we have heard very frequently with educational institutions have been their impact upon downtown parking, and that has been a significant point of discussion during the considerations that we've had of those. 2 of the 3 approved conditional use permits have included a requirement they provide off-street parking to mitigate their disproportionate impact. And in those scenarios, the buildings were analyzed, assumptions were made what the typical highest and best use for downtown would be of that building and the parking demand that that building would generate underneath that scenario. And any difference in parking above that number was required to be mitigated by those users. And so that was 2 of the 3. So both the new St. Andrews applications had parking mitigation that they had to conduct. The University of Idaho is the 3rd entity for the WWAMI Anatomy Lab on the 3rd floor of Gritman's new medical office building. And when we did the analysis of medical office use of that building, which is what we felt was the most comparable use, the educational institution use actually had a lower parking demand than the medical office use. And there's no parking required of any of them, but it's our way of assessing what is their disproportionate impact that may need to be mitigated, and that was the most logical way that we could see to come to that. So for the WWAMI program, then no mitigation was required in that instance. Now, conditional uses, as defined by the code, it means a use permitted in one or more zoning districts as defined by the zoning code, but which, because of the characteristics peculiar to such use, or because of size, technological processes, or equipment, or because of the exact location with reference to the surroundings, streets, and existing improvements, or demands upon public facilities, requires a special degree of control to make the use consistent with and compatible with other existing or permissible uses in the same zoning district. So the general premise is it's a permitted use in that zoning district, but it requires special review, and it requires that review to place those controls in, if there are any that are necessary, to ensure that it's consistent and compatible with surrounding land uses as well as can be served by the public infrastructure. And so it's important to recognize, I guess, that it's generally identified as being permitted use, and the only way that it truly should be denied is if there's no way to make it compatible or no way to mitigate those impacts. Otherwise, if it's been listed as a conditionally permitted use, then it's generally presumed that it will be an allowed use, unless it just has something unique about that site, and that particular use or the scale of that use cannot be mitigated in some fashion. Within the central business district, there are a number of conditionally permitted use. So antenna towers is one, daycare facilities, educational services, which the educational institutions fit within, funeral homes and services, hospitals, public services, utility facilities, auto and RV dealers, and auto repair and maintenance facilities are identified as conditionally permitted. Oh, gas stations is the last one. Oh, I lied. Car, RV, and truck rentals. I think that's the last one. Click the button. Yes. So those are the list of current conditionally permitted uses within the central business district today. So there, in any consideration of a conditional use permit, this council has specified in their code criteria that the zoning board of adjustment is to utilize in evaluating that use. And so they are, the criteria we've identified that has been adopted in the code is a proposed use is a conditionally permitted use in the zoning district, which if it wasn't, we wouldn't really be having that hearing. But that is first. They need to make a finding that it is a conditionally permitted use in the zoning district. The second criteria is the character of the proposed use will be in harmony with the neighborhood and surrounding land uses. The third is the proposed use as approved or as approved with conditions will not generate nuisances that would be injurious or detrimental to adjoining properties or the neighborhood, including but not limited to noise, dust, glare, vibration, odors, and the like. Fourth, the location, design, and size of the proposed use will be adequately served by existing streets, public facilities, and services. And five, the proposed use will not endanger the public health or safety if located where proposed. And finally, the proposed use meets all applicable development standards in the zoning code. And then the proposed use will not be in conflict with the comprehensive plan. So those are the 7 criteria that the Board of Adjustment, in reviewing an application for a conditionally permitted use, has to review and has to make findings to support the approval of the use. So the Central Business District, I know most people envision it as just being Main Street, but it is a larger area than that. It does extend out the 3rd Street corridor and does extend out the 6th Street corridor, and it goes about 2 blocks to the west of Main Street as well, all the way over to Jefferson Street. So the area shaded in green is the Central Business District, and along with this small little island, that is the Gritman Medical Office Building today. The council, I believe, rezoned that property from its prior industrial designation to central business, I want to say in 2006. I'm sorry, I did not look that one up. But that previously was a grain elevator site and was previously zoned industrial. And so it was zoned general business, or central business, I'm sorry. And so when Gritman developed that facility recently, you may note that they had, fairly little parking that went along with it because that use, because it was in the Central Business District, was exempted from the parking table. I think they had 12 spaces in front, and they've now done 34 maybe in the parking lot across from Jackson. If you were looking at the table, it probably would require 200 for that use. But it was zoned central business, and it was their right to develop the facility in that way. So there are existing educational institution uses within the Central Business District include New St. Andrews, both in the Scedabo building. Currently, they were approved then in 2006 with a maximum enrollment of 200 students. I believe this last year on their website, they reflected 181 enrollment in that location for the last academic year. We also have the CJ building that was the last approved conditional use permit, well, for New St. Andrews. That they requested a maximum of 300 students, which was approved last year. University of Idaho WAMI program, again, the Gritman Medical Building, they indicated the facility is intended to accommodate 40 students. It's not the entirety of their facilities, it's just the anatomy lab for the WAMI program. So it's essentially a remote satellite classroom to work and integrate with Gritman's medical providers and instructors. For the anatomy components, they also are going to be occupying the prior incubator building for office space for that program and classroom space. But the university intends to only have 40 students at the anatomy lab at any given time. So that was what they requested and what was approved. Again, there was parking mitigation required for both of these requests and none for the Gritman request. If you look at the total area, educational institutions currently occupy about 3.2% of the total land area, lot area, within the Central Business Zoning District, and those are identified here and that includes both the Scatabo building, some deduction for the Bloom commercial frontage, the prior CJ's building, the NSA parking lots on Jackson Street, as well as the Gritman property, and then just an allocation for the WAMI facility there. Since it only occupies 1/6 of the entire building, we allocated 1/6 of the property area to that. So we have about 44,000 square feet of educational institutional use currently within the Central Business District. And I think on the street frontage is somewhere in the very similar percentage of overall street frontage it could be for retail use. And we've discussed the fact that New St. Andrews has been required to provide 89 private off-street parking spaces to mitigate their disproportionate impact upon parking downtown. So within recent applications, so last year, the city did consider and approve 2 conditional use permits for educational institutions in those last 12 months. And again, that was the CJ's building for New St. Andrews and Gritman's WAMI facility. This New St. Andrews application did receive several hours of public testimony, and the board's decision was appealed, and the council is well aware that was heard by the council. It was ultimately approved with the condition that they provide the 47 parking spaces within 1/4 mile of the property to mitigate their impact. The WAMI permit really received no public testimony in opposition and was approved with no conditions. So just for a history of what's been approved in the last 12 months, those are the 2 applications that we have seen. After the significant discussion surrounding the CJ's application, the city administration included a survey question in the fall 2017 commission survey. And this was the first year, I think, that we had broken apart the commission survey and then the just general city services survey. And so this was added underneath the Planning and Zoning Commission's list. It wasn't a question that they submitted as a commission, but it fit into the land use category, and so that's where it was located. The question read that the city of Moscow currently allows public and private colleges and universities as educational uses within the Central Business Zoning District, downtown Moscow, when granted a conditional use permit. The conditional use permit provides an opportunity to review the proposed use to determine if any conditions should be required in order to reduce any potential negative impacts of the proposed conditional use. Given this process, do you agree that the educational uses should be allowed within the Central Business District through a conditional use permit property? And we had 62% that responded yes and 32% that replied no. Now, there have been concerns that have been expressed regarding the wording of the question and how respondents may have interpreted it, and it's very, very difficult in one question to truly explore an issue. And so, it's uncertain if people just felt comfortable with the current level of educational institutions or expanded or any new. And so, with one question, you just didn't have the opportunity to ask that level of detail at that point in time. During that recent hearing, not on July 21st, on May 21st, the council discussed the continued allowance of educational institutions within the Central Business District. The council expressed a desire to have the Planning and Zoning Commission review educational uses within the Central Business Zone and requested that the Administrative Committee review the matter, which is what we are here today to discuss. As I mentioned, during the recent zoning code update, the Planning and Zoning Commission did directly discuss educational institutions downtown, and they did review the results of that single question of the commission survey before they forwarded their recommendation onto the City Council, which was the ordinance that you considered on May 21st. In light of that, staff was seeking from the council kind of what new additional information does the council feel that the commission should look at. I mean, they have discussed this as a whole. They have reviewed that bit of public input, that one question for whatever it is worth, that did have that information available to them. And so in order to bring that back to the commission, really it's helpful to have some specific direction about what it is the council would like the commission to consider. If the council would like to develop a broader understanding of the community's opinion on the issue, the city will be conducting another city survey coming up this fall. And it's not technically the commission survey, it's really the city service survey, but that might present another opportunity to maybe obtain more extensive information about the community's opinion and to gain a better understanding of the community's opinion on that topic. Several questions could be developed to address the question of any new, current level of use, any new uses, any expansion of use to kind of fully gauge what the public feels about that topic. It also could be an opportunity for us to do a separate survey. Generally, the city's surveys go out to residential mailing addresses. And so we may pick up some residents living downtown, but it's not going to be directed to any commercial or business addresses. And so in this process, we could do a separate survey of downtown business owners or property owners. We could work to define that to ask the same or similar questions of them.
In addition to the.
Correct.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, we could, and we haven't had a chance to talk with Jan about that, we could do something separate. We could take the same survey and just do a subset to just the downtown business community, however we want to do it. That would be probably an important thing to consider as the council considers any significant policy changes in that matter. And that information then can be utilized. That would give the commission something to review, to evaluate, some new information that maybe hasn't been present before, and for the council to consider really what the community's opinion on that topic is. So I guess that would be my suggestion, and I'd be happy to try to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Can you pull up the map of the CBD and the surrounding districts?
Yeah.
I've always found it odd that little CB piece down there exists, and I wonder.
It is.
Yeah, one thing I've been curious about is the possibility of a medical district or something akin to that. I don't know if that would be appropriate for P&Z to study.
So we've looked at the south end of downtown as being a medical district, somewhat in maybe branding, not necessarily in zoning. Now, it's a bit unusual because we have this industrial zone here, which is a historical fragment, and Brunel's on one part of it, and the docks parking garage is in part of the other. And it is one of those areas that probably shouldn't be industrial right there on Main Street, but it's a remnant that's connected to the broader area across on the west side of Jackson there. It's one of those things that, if you regulate land uses so restricted that only medical providers can go in an area, I mean, it's okay if it's maybe generally owned by Gritman, but if you have other private property owners that would be involved in it, and just limiting them only to medical providers is something that I think we'd have to carefully consider. It'd be one thing if it's all owned by, let's say, Gritman, and it's only Gritman property that's being applied to. I think that's certainly something that we could look at. We've looked at it in the terms of, really, quite honestly, as parking management and branding in that area. So at not too distant past, Gritman had made a request to potentially vacate a portion of Main Street or vacate 8th Street in order to make more room for their expansion. And it wasn't something that we necessarily supported, but we wanted to support their success. And really, they want to try to create that campus environment for the medical service industry that is growing down in the south end of Maine. And we wanted to be supportive of that, but we also wanted to make sure that the public had access to those rights of way. Once they're vacated, they're in perpetuity. Right. And it's not a action the council generally takes lightly. But we wanted to support the concept of a medical district, and really in looking at some of the on-street parking management in that south end to try to best facilitate and support the medical services that are being offered in that area. And the Transportation Commission has reviewed that a couple of times. I think they'll be coming back here in the next couple of meetings as well. And that's why you'll see that even in some of the improvements that were done as part of the last medical office building, the light fixtures are different. They're silver, they're not the black historical. We really kind of opened the door for them to help kind of brand that area around the medical services that Gritman offers, because they are a significant and important community partner, and their success is something that's important to us, and continue to provide expanded services to the community and region. And so we've looked at it from a branding side, but we haven't really looked at it from a land use perspective. Most of Gritman's property, the hospital itself, is general business. And general business is much like central business in that it has really no setback requirements and allows a lot of the same uses, but general business requires off-street parking. And so that's really one of the most significant distinctions between the two. The uniqueness of central business is the fact that it does not require off-street parking for any use that is there, unless it's gone through a discretionary land use approval and mitigation has been required, as has happened with a couple of educational institutions.
For those numbers again, so you said NSA it was 89, CJ's 47. Can you remind me what WWAMI was again? The parking mitigation number?
There was nothing for WWAMI, and 89 is the combined Scatabo and CJ's building total. Yep. But WWAMI's use, as we did the calculation, was actually less than the medical office use. So we really had no basis of mitigation requirement at that point.
Do you have any more questions?
Do you have an estimate of what it would have been for all three buildings if they had been some other designation, general business, say?
Oh, I don't have that off the top of my head. So I think New St. Andrews, if it was outside, would have been, well, I could get that information for you. I really hate to speculate. I don't have that one right off
I
the
would
top of my head.
appreciate knowing that number.
And I'd be
Thank
happy to email that out to the committee and the council.
Great.
That'd be good.
And you're looking at just educational institution use, not the medical office building demand?
That one as well,
Okay.
yeah. That's it for now.
Okay. Art, you have some questions?
Not really questions, more like comments that I like the idea of going forth and asking some more pointed or directed questions in the next survey to help inform exactly the feeling of the community. And relative to the conditional use permitting process, I've always had this big hang-up on the degree of mitigation. You can mitigate the impact, in this case, parking, on an educational use in the central business district, but then you get into the impact on surrounding neighborhoods and in fact the district itself, where you've got a central business district and suddenly it's surrounded by a donut of parking, and it starts to look like just a giant mall after a while, where you've got your businesses and buildings and then there's parking all the way around it. Now, how does the line get drawn there? And
many downtowns promote that.
Yeah.
The idea that, parking should be on the periphery and the downtown core should be buildings and shops and storefronts and the pedestrian. I mean, that is a natural occurrence that happens in many downtown centers, is the edge of the downtown becomes the parking areas.
which is something I'm not sure is a benefit to Moscow as it sits, because we have neighborhoods here, we have the university there, and now we're impacting neighborhoods outside central business, and how the decision is made to determine whether that is a mitigable or an unmitigable use that happens that needs to be mitigated, but that's going to have an impact. Where the line gets drawn is really, really fuzzy, and
And why that specific use? I mean, you could have a business with 200 employees moving into that building and have the same demand, and it'd be used by right.
yeah, exactly. But then when you're considering a conditional use, you have to adhere to the conditional use permitting criteria before you can go on with that. And so that's my big hanging point on this. I don't know quite what to think, so I'm hoping that perhaps getting some more information from a survey would help inform not only me, but perhaps the rest of the council on what's the will of the community and get a better idea.
I would tend to agree with that. I think it's important, however, to do the dual-pronged approach that you spoke of, where we make certain that we do survey the community at large, but then also the downtown business district as well, because I think that's important to get both sides of that. While I share Art's concern with where the line is drawn regarding parking, I think the conditional use process itself has proven over time to be very effective. It can be somewhat painful, and lots of hours get eaten up in the process, but I do believe that it is an effective process. So I'm hearing and hoping that both of you will agree with me. I think we ought to forward this on to council. I'd like to have this presentation at the council meeting, if we could, please. Does that necessitate next Monday? Or is that enough?
I think
Mr. Mayor,
scheduling.
come
There
on
he
up,
is.
sir.
I would make a recommendation. If you want to do that in front of the full council, I think that's terrific, but we won't have a full council at the next council meeting. So
Indeed.
I'd
That's
suggest
why I
that you
asked
have it
that.
when all 6 councilors are available to be there.
Okay, let's do
And
that.
the catch is too, and the discussion that you had right here was about surveys as well. Well, those surveys won't come out for quite some time.
Yeah, we typically do those surveys in late August or
Yep.
early September,
And
with
so-
results back by the end of the year.
I mean, it could be a discussion point, but it really won't be a decision made. Gina, so I just wanted to bring that forward to you, so that's something to think about, but that should be something that's worthwhile for all
That
councilors
actually
to hear.
might work out fine depending on when our cross-country traveling councilman gets back to. It might be kind of the same
Yep.
time frame. So, okay, so.
We'll schedule accordingly.
Schedule accordingly, and then I think it would be, as far as the development of the questions, does that come afterwards, if that's what we decide as a council? Is that how that goes?
I think so, and I think
Okay,
we'd want
awesome.
the council to be involved in that process.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
I think we'd like
Indeed.
to have the council's support of the wording of the question, just to ensure the council gets the information that the council desires to have.
Okay. I think this is a big enough discussion and big enough issue that it warrants all six of us
Makes sense.
on it. So, okay. Thank you very much for your
you.
report, sir. That is the end of our regular agenda. We have two reports, looks like from the same superstar presenter, Kathleen. I always look forward to your presentations. Yep, because of that color. I love that color.
What color would you call that?
It's an acid green. It is.
Thank you, Zach. Great. Okay, so I thought it was time to give you a public art update because we've been pretty busy out there
Indeed.
in the public art. And so there's been some changes through town, and I thought it was time to update everybody on what's been going on. So this is a big one. This is the Wallace Bus Shelter in front of the Wallace Living and Learning Center. And this is a project that's generated through the Graphic Arts program at the University of Idaho under Delphine Keim. And we had about 12 submissions, and it was very tough. And so the people that were on the review board was our own vinyl guy, Steve from Cutting Edge, 2 MAC members, Living Learning Center RA students that were in charge of different floors, Brian Johnson from facilities, and then another person I can't remember, and also our own Daniel Gray, who's with Smart Transit. So this is Peyton Glover, and she developed this graphic, and it's installed on the bus shelter, and I don't have an actual photograph, I just have the graphic to show you, which is Your Story Begins Here. So it's a pretty neat one. The next one to talk about is your vinyl wraps are changing around town, and they're awfully fun. And just to let you know who's who and where. So Justin Picard is the 6th and Jackson piece with the mushrooms. And then Daniel Mitten is the piece with the transit figures, which is at 6th and Washington. So it's kind of fun. And we put that one near the co-op because there's a lot of kid traffic near the co-op. This is your new Allison Meyer piece out by the Helioterra, and it needed to be replaced because the yellow was really having a pigment issue. So we're hoping for greens and blues, and so far a lot of really good compliments on that one. And then at 3rd and Washington and 3rd and Jackson, these are 2 new installations, and the artist is Julene Ewert. She created both of those. This one I haven't had a chance to photograph yet, and it's out by our wastewater reclamation center on the Chipman Trail. And this was a very difficult piece. This was a student, Dominic Chiramonti. He also works at Breakfast Club, so shout out. He had a lot of different microbial bacteria, but it wasn't personalized enough to our wastewater reclamation center. And so our biologist and microbiologists and then staff out there were real specific on they wanted their Moscow bears and they wanted all these specific bacteria. And so that student had to work very hard to make that piece specific to Moscow. And it's really beautiful, and it really highlights the trail. So the big one that we've been working on for quite a while is the public library. And Melissa Cole has been extremely busy over there doing all the install. And the mayor is here, and we'll be doing a dedication on Friday at 4 o'clock, and hopefully everybody can come. I'm seeing a lot of people walking around the library and pointing their fingers, and we're going to have a legend on where their clouds and flowers and their leaves are. But mostly everybody's already finding their pieces, which is really great because there's a lot going on over there. The install took pretty much close to an entire week. She worked through Memorial Weekend and brought in volunteers from, this is a retired Coeur d'Alene art teacher that gave her 2 days. And it took quite a bit of time. So Melissa Cole will be here on Friday for the dedication, and pretty excited about that. So, and I talked to the neighbor today who's across the street from the library, and she absolutely loves it, which is important because she's looking at it every day. So, the welder came down, Brad, and he was on the front page of the paper with his dad installing the steel sculpture, and Melissa enameled the pieces. So that was quite a big project as well. The next is our ITC center has the new sculpture garden pieces in, and we have a variety of different artists that installed pinwheels to dandelions to a sculpture of a giraffe to a pretty cool bug, and I forget what type of bug it was, but including a walking wheel. So again, this year, these were all college students from the University of Idaho and the Sculpture Lab, which is about a block away from the ITC. The changes for this year is the people that were on the selection committee were with ITC. We held the jury selection right at ITC. And so parking was involved, the bus folks were involved, MAC members were involved, and so it was really great because a lot of the jury selection happens, the installation happens, the help is through facilities with University of Idaho for welding. But the parking enforcement and the people that work for ITC are the ones that look at the sculptures every day and keep track of pedestrians and are able to answer a lot of questions. And yeah, so it's pretty fun.
Do you know the pinwheel actually turns?
Mm-hmm. It does. Yeah.
To check it. It really works. It's so cool.
Yeah. So that's that. Now I'm going to skip over to Art Walk. And we have 5 minutes.
5 or 7. You could have 7 if it's, oh, you only have 4 slides. You're going to stretch it out for 5 minutes. Okay.
So at 4:15 today, we're going to be installing Erica Wagner's work. This is our first time having a digital photography. And you might know Erica's work because the magazine for the co-op, the Roots magazine, she was the photographer and writer for a lot of those entries into the co-op. So we're kind of busy this year with Art Walk. We have 74 businesses and over 125 artists. There's probably 4 or 5 more businesses that are going to jump in that didn't make the deadline for the brochure. We have a lot of arts and crafts demonstrations on Main Street, from glass blowers to forge guys, and we'll be laying that out. The music at Friendship Square, We start off the night with 5 o'clock with Runaway Symphony. They're all back in town, and they're pretty popular. The Moscow Arts Commission Band will be there under Albert Miller, and Dan Buckfitch will be playing drums. So they had over 200 people at the park listening to them on Thursday night. So one of our favorites is the Panhandle Cowboys, and they sang for the Appaloosa exhibit here. And then we're going to close the night with Malonga. And I just wanted to bring up a fact that Malonga was selected for Art Walk back when Jim Bolin was on the liaison for the MAC. So we plan Art Walk 6 to 8 months out. And Jim was like, well, I think they'd be a great headliner. Okay. So we have Malonga. And down at First and Main, we have Phoenix Blues Band, and then Shiloh and the Young Guns.
She's awesome.
She's awesome, yeah. So there's a lot going on Art Walk. Aside from the dedication at the library, we also have an installation that's going to be created and sent up from Boise from the Idaho Commission on the Arts. And this is a brochure that they developed of students throughout the state of Idaho. But we're blessed because the students that are in this and will be shown at Wells Fargo are from Lena Whitmore and also Troy Elementary School. So we have folks coming in from ICA tomorrow to help with this, and a truck coming on Wednesday. This is your map of Art Walk. It's pretty crowded, but there's just a lot going on, and you can see all the way down to Gritman, all the way over to the Transit Center, PCEI, 1912 Center. So we're pretty busy. Our own Public Works Department is doing their plows on Main Street and their gallery for storm drains and a lot of different things. We have the sculptures at the Transit Center. And then Jenny's here, and I'd like to bring her up to talk about the tile mural that they're going to dedicate at the courthouse on Friday at noon. And that's been an long-going project.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Well,
Thank you.
Jenny Ford from our chamber, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me. This project is a real collaborative effort between the Moscow Chamber of Commerce, the Idaho Arts Commission, the City of Moscow Arts Commission, as well as the county and Wild at Art, a local business here in town. This all started during Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. It's an annual event that takes place January 9th, and the group had determined that we really want to show our support for women and men in law enforcement more than just one day out of the year. And so this tile mosaic was created by family members who have individuals in the line of duty or unfortunately have lost those in the line of duty. There are a little over 80 tiles that have been created at Wild at Art. The actual installation will be up at Latah County. There is a specific unveiling at 12 o'clock on Friday, June 15th. Hopefully none of you do anything after 12 o'clock on June 15th because we have your schedule slated. There are many, many unveilings and events that day. However, we would appreciate any and all of your support as city council members, as well as the mayor to be there. There will be Richie Skiles will be speaking, as well as hopefully Roger Lanier from your Moscow Police Department. And we just really want to express how much we appreciate those that are in the line of duty that protect our community every day, and express that we are a community that supports our law enforcement officers.
So who's coming to town on Wednesday?
Thank you. Chris Carlson. For those of you that were here for Art Walk last year, Chris Carlson was the 3D chalk artist that was outside of the Moscow Chamber of Commerce last year, and we are very lucky to have him come again. He will be here in council chambers on Wednesday the 13th at 5 p.m. to do a presentation open to the public. Light refreshments will be provided. So for those of you that can come and hear him speak, that's great. And if you're unable to come that day, Thursday, half day Wednesday, and on all day Thursday and all day Friday, he will be completing his work outside of the Moscow Chamber of Commerce. So lots of really fun stuff going on.
So with that, any questions about Art Walk? Do you know where you're going, where you're going to start?
When do the
Do you have your
brochures come out?
pedometer on? Do you have your
When do those come out?
bicycle? I really recommend
Just
riding a
walking.
bike. These are coming out, I have some downstairs, if you'd like one. But they come out in the paper on Friday, and the Lewiston Tribune, the Moscow Pullman Daily News. We have 1,000 extra that are at the Chamber of Commerce for our downtown businesses. Zion's will be blowing up all the balloons, and all the signs and sticks will be going out on Friday afternoon.
That is so
and-
fun.
And you'll have a sticker on the front page of your paper when you open your paper on Friday, reminding you Friday is Art Walk. So, kind of big.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions or anything? I love Art Walk Week. Awesome. Thank you for the report.
Thank you
Now
for
we're all
allowing me to
excited.
speak.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing me up here.
Okay.
Okay, shall we adjourn?
Let's-
Okay, so moved.